Welcome back, listeners, to this episode of the BizBlend podcast. I'm your host, Sana, as always. And today's episode is actually hitting a nerve that every founder secretly feels but rarely says out loud. Well, we talk a lot about scaling, revenue milestones, exits, crushing goals. But somewhere between all those dashboards and the dopamine hits from monthly growth updates, there is a truth we keep avoiding. Growth doesn't always mean value. Progress doesn't always mean direction. And revenue alone doesn't guarantee the business is healthy or future proof. Now, I want listeners to today's conversation to feel like that moment when you finally admit to yourself that the numbers look good, but the story behind those numbers is messy. That moment when you realize your business might be growing, but it's not necessarily growing into the thing you actually want to build. So, listeners, for all of you, I brought someone who lives at this very intersection of clarity and courage. Our guest, Rafael Pinho, is a finance executive and CFA charter holder who has a real talent for cutting through founder noise. He helps leaders understand not just what their numbers say, but what their numbers mean. He's the guy who sees both the forest and the trees and hands you the map so you don't get lost in either. So, listeners, this conversation is going to challenge some assumptions. It might stink, but in a good way. But more importantly, it's going to offer founders a fresh lens on what value truly is and why more revenue isn't the prize we think is. So, Rafael, welcome to the show, and I'm really, really excited for this conversation.
I'm exhilarated by that intro, Sana. Thanks for having me. And yeah, let's get onto it.
Exactly, exactly. And Rafael, I think um it's natural. I mean, there is nothing bad in, focusing on revenue profit because yeah, at the end of the day, um money does matter, revenue profit does matter. But then there's this obsession, with a lot of founders over revenue because it is the easiest metric to brag about. So from your perspective, why isn't growing revenue enough to actually build enterprise value?
Wow, that's a, a focal point on what we do. And as you already mentioned, it very common problem. People tend to focus on revenue just because it's easy to measure. And revenue is the beginning of all, right? You have to be selling, you have to be turning business to have a business. And people fall in love with just tracking revenue as revenue was a synonym for the value of the business when it's not, as you said it. And it's not because revenue is the start of all, but revenue is not cash flow. There's a great difference between those two. Um, Revenue is the top line, as people say, but then the bottom line is what matters the most. And most of all, that bottom line is turning into cash in the bank. You probably heard the cliche, "Cash is king," and that's what we're talking about here. So sometimes you're making a lot of revenue, but not with a good enough profit margin, not good enough as to pay for all overhead costs and leave some money in the bank at the end. So that's a very common misunderstanding that we see out there. People try to value their business based on revenue, and that's not how it works. If you have an investment, if you let's think of maybe stocks, right? How do you value stocks in the listed world? You look at a dividend, and the dividend comes from that cash flow. So you need to have to be building value. You need to have cash flow, and that's a very common misconception. Sana.
I definitely agree. Definitely agree. It's like uh, your salary or your paycheck could be. I mean, if I talk with the preference of India, like it could be in crores or lakhs. But then at the end of the month, or maybe after removing all the deductions and everything, what exactly, and all the expenses and savings, what exactly is there in hand with you? I think that is something a lot of people, especially founders in the early stage, they may have this misconception, and I think it's a common blind spot, definitely. Um,
It's a great example that you just gave us. People could relate to their personal finances. Your salary is your top line. That's your revenue. Your wealth is normally what's left afterwards, is what you're able to actually save and have in the bank. Just going back to my what you have in the bank, your cash is king. So what you can hold on to is your net margin, right? On the personal side. So your parallel there is just perfect.
mm, and when you talk about something called as value gap. So, what are the early warning signs that a founder is building a bigger and busier business, however, not a more valuable one? I mean, how would you define that, first of all?
Um, there are two types of value gaps that we see all the time, and we see business owners and entrepreneurs trapped into trying to understand them. The first one, the most common one, is people just look at it all the time at this market references, tables, recent transactions that they see around them, and they say, "Oh, so my business could be worth X times multiple over my EBITDA or net operating income, any sort of metric, right?" And they think that just because business A sold for that, any business would sell or transact for the same multiple, and that's not true. The reason why that's not true is that there's so much more in business valuation than just that multiple and that number. That number is the result. That number is getting across the finish line. But to get across the finish line, there are so many things and boxes that need to be checked. Are your documents in order? Are your finances in order? Are um, do you have SOPs for your operation? So is everything documented? Ultimately, is the business dependent on the business owner? And that gets us to the real big value gap, especially in smaller businesses. The dependency on the business owner uh, is a value detractor in itself, because when that business owner goes away, the business is not running as it used to. And
Mm.
that's another big step in terms of the value gap. We actually have a name for that. We usually call that the transferable value. So one thing is the business value, which again, there's normally a gap to the, say, marketplace business value. And then there's the second step, which is the actual transferable value. So just to put a quick number here, let's say that this business is turning around $1 million cash flow, and it may be worth, say, I don't know, just think of a sector that can go between 3 and 5 times multiple. So it would mean anywhere between 3 and 5 million, right? However, put it simply, if 100% of the sales depends on the business owner doing it, and if that business owner wants to step away as he sells and transacts the business, guess what? The business is now worth zero, because I, as an investor, and that's my specialty, have that investor look into things, will say, hmm, I don't know if I'll be able to replace those sales after you are gone, which normally leads to a tough conversation that is, I need you to stick around for the next 5 years working for me as an investor, um, as we transfer that sales generating capacity to someone else, either the investor or an employee that that investor will look to put in place. You know what I mean? So that's huge. That's that kills more potential deals than anything else.
It definitely does. And I think this um, extrapolates across different, phases in there. I mean, till like exit or after exit also, because especially in today's age, when we have startups or brands kind of, having their founders as the face in there, it kind of becomes a very tight, rope walk in there to kind of establish that, separation or that boundary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that boundary, that identity gap is also a big problem. When you start a business, and I've seen it all around, oh, there's no problem using my cell phone as my business number. Guess what? 10 years down the road, you might be looking into a situation where your personal phone has to go with the business, or the business is worth less. Because if that's been the phone number for the business for 10 years and that's the primary source of businesses, guess what? That's a part of the business. That's no longer your phone. Very common and traditional mistake. I understand all the crowd behind it. People tend to name the companies after themselves, which especially in smaller and tight knit communities, it's a marketing tool as well, because your integrity and your uh, uh, good faith and name are important, right? That said, down the road, it creates a problem, because now I want to retire or transfer the business to someone else, and I'm thinking they are going to be using my name. At the same time, they are going to be thinking, well, if we change the name of a business, it might lose sales. So it's it's complicated. And going back to your point, my suggestion and what we see as a biggest thing to do in terms of value enhancing is, as you start with your goal in mind. What Start as if you would say sell or transact or transition tomorrow. If you would transition tomorrow, what are the boxes I need to check? And then start from the get go doing things right, getting that separate business phone line, making sure that the name is not your name, so on and so forth.
Hmm. And let's say, Rafael, if the founder recognizes that gap too late, um, do you think there's a way out? And if yes, then what's the very first practical step they should take to course correct?
Yes, that is. And it's very common that they realize these things too late. The first one, and we already touched on it, is owner dependence. I always tell my clients that if they want to test my assumptions about the business destruction, the business value destruction for owner dependency, I'll tell them to take 3 weeks vacation, no phones, no email. They will normally say, "Oh, I cannot do that." I say, "Well, if you cannot do that, you're in deep trouble, because this is you're not passing test one of any type of diligence a minimally diligent investor would do. So let's start working on that. Let's start taking out uh, the dependency on the day to day. And oftentimes they think, well, but if I hire someone to do these things, that will hurt my cash flow. It may, it may cost you some, but again, when you think of return multiples and the value destruction, and you put that in perspective, that's actually a great investment. So you got to look at it as an investment, not as an expense. And oftentimes, what I see business owners realize is that when they start to delegate and detach themselves from the day to day, they stop working in the business and start working on the business. As in, they start really thinking the strategy. Sorry, I got it wrong there. It's in the business, not on the business, right? So they start working on the strategy. They start working on thinking on the vision, as they should. They are ultimately the CEO of their business, even if it's one or a couple of people business, right?
Yeah, agree, agree. And now I want to bring in here, especially when it comes to investment, um, you know, to look at both the sides of the spectrum in here. So let's first look at the founders side, Rafael, that now I have had conversations, and because I've had the experience of working with a lot of startup founders as well. Um, a few, some of them they say that let's begin with first understanding the product market fit, or how, whether what I am building or creating something is actually, fitting into the market or not. Let's see the stability maybe for the first 5, 6 years, and then we'll think about investment. So maybe they'll go through other modes of investment. Maybe, they'll um, crowdfund, or maybe in stealth mode or something like that. But then there will be founders who will be, coming up with a brilliant business plan or a product. And they'll be also looking very actively for investors, because they'll definitely need a lot of, money to flow, to operate, to invest. So what do you think? I mean, which option is better? Especially for an early stage founder, is it necessary to look out for investors immediately, once they have an idea, or once they start with the execution, in terms of, financial, like in with the financial aspect in mind?
That's an absolutely great question. Um, People tend to make those decisions based out of some form of emotion or fear of failure, and they ultimately destroy a lot of value not taking that decision objectively. So, what I would suggest is have someone you can trust on the financial side of things help you model the actual cash needs to get the business to where you want, and then start working your options. Because what I see again and again is people selling way too soon in terms of raising some form of equity, and as they do that, they ultimately leave a lot on the table because um, it's a general truth. The smaller you are, the more expensive equity is going to be for the founder. And when I say it's expensive for the founders, because it's going to have to dilute itself, i.e., sell a bigger stake of the company to raise the same amount of money as opposed to a bigger business, right? So the more you can defer that, the best. And it begs the question, all right, if I'm going to defer it, how I'm going to finance it? We'll go back to your first question, Sana. If we can take care of cash flow first, internal cash flow is a great way of financing. And more than that, if we create uh, if we create predictability, I mean the
Mhm.
ability to make sure that anyone looking from inside out this business is going to be able to see that the business is cash flowing at some level. It even opens the room for you being able to lever up, get a loan. And but the first thing a bank is going to ask is your financial statements. If you go to your bank manager and he asks for the statements and it takes you 3 months to come up with the numbers, that's a yellow flag right there, right? So that's where the boring part of finance becomes vital. You got to have your numbers right. You got to have your financial processes right. So you're able to have those conversations in a timely manner. And another piece of advice on that, so that raising money don't cost you the house, the sooner the better. People tend to just go look for that fundraise, be it debt or equity, when it's far too late and they don't have time. And not having time when you need to raise any sort of funding tends to make it more expensive. So plan accordingly, uh, do your math, understand which is the better way before you set about to go and fundraise. And that's a process. It can be taught, it can be learned, and it can be guided with a trusted advisor.
Exactly, exactly. And I think one word that you mentioned is boring. It can be boring, but the sooner it is done, the safer, the better you are in position.
Absolutely. I get it all the time. I know that people think that finance people are nerdy, weirders, and boring that just talk numbers. And um, I see that numbers are just the beginning. I prefer to use the term financial storytelling. Your numbers tell a story. And if that story is well told, the ability to finance any business just skyrockets. But it starts with the numbers. I cannot do nothing, or nor does any financial guy out there, if you don't have the basics. If you don't have a P&L and a balance sheet that you can look at and say, okay, I can work with this, right? So it starts, as I told, on the boring side, but it can get pretty exciting, and you'd be amazed by the how much more you can do when you have good numbers to work with versus when you're done. When you're done, meaning that similar businesses, same size, same activity, same margins, can be quote unquote more valuable just because they present themselves in a better way.
Exactly. Exactly. And then let's explore the other end as well, Rafael, of the spectrum. Now, investors are notoriously selective. In your experience, what are the top three things investors actually look for that most founders commonly underestimate or maybe ignore entirely?
That's an amazing question. We see it all the time. There are three things. I can distill everything down. It boils down to three things: predictability, how predictable your business is. You have systems, processes, everything is documented. Can I really get my analyst, if I'm a investment fund or just an investor doing analysis myself, can I really trust a financial projection that I build because I trust the documentation you have to show me and prove me that I can do that? So predictability is number one. Profitability, um, I don't say it's number two because it goes hand in hand with predictability. If you are profitable, you're easy to predict, right? So that's why higher margin businesses think think real estate as opposed to retail, right? Why is real estate way more valuable if you think real estate as a business, not as an asset class, because margins in general are way higher. So profitability is the second thing. Cash is king. I'll go back to the basics. Make sure from every cent coming in as revenue, the most possible ultimately stays in the bank. And obviously growth. Investors, they are looking for growth. They are looking for a business that has been showing steady growth. So I've had clients who just told me, "Oh, but I just grew 50% over the last year." It means that investors are going to pay more for my business. Well, it really depends. Is that growth just a one-off because they just hit off a big piece of business that year, or can you prove that that's actually recurring? And recurring, I'll go back to predictability. The more recurring your business is, the more predictable it is, the more valuable it will be. So let's think for a moment, HVAC companies or plumbing services, just housing services, right? Um, One thing is great company that gets a business from their phone every day. The other thing is the same company, like same size, but has their clients on long-term contracts. I'm sure that the second one is easier to predict, and it should be more profitable because they're not all the time acquiring clients. And I'm sure that that company is going to be more valuable. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. 100% refer. 100%. Hmm. Um, and it's kind of related. So in like recently we see scenarios. For example, um, it can be industry agnostic, but uh, some really ambitious plans on scalability or expansion, and then lo and behold, there is something like a pandemic, like an event, or maybe an economic crash dawning, upon. So, from a financial perspective, Rafael, Are there any guardrails or any kind of practices that you would recommend, especially for the young, early stage founders or young founders, so that they can take it up and make sure that they are able to at least mitigate the risks. They may not be able to completely eradicate the risks, but at least they're able to mitigate.
Absolutely. You'd be amazed to know, Sana, how many businesses I've encountered, and I'm talking 20 million plus revenue, that run without the simplest of the financial projections. So they don't even run on a budget. And running a business like that is like trying to go on a hike without a compass. So you're certainly going to get lost or eventually hit a tree. And I think we don't want neither of both. So start with the basics. I see a lot of business owners that they manage finance by looking at the balance on their checking accounts. That's that's managing with your looks, with your eyes looking back, not forward. So first thing you got to do is have at least a 12, 13 weeks, meaning a quarter ahead projection. Get whatever expectation of revenues you have, expectations of dates of payments, expectations of payments to suppliers, right? To produce that revenue, to deliver on that revenue, and start managing from there. Then start trying to make sure that you can forecast longer. Try a 6 month rolling projection. And as soon as possible, try to run the business on at least 1 year forward projection or 1 year budget. And if every month, month in and month out, you start getting on the cadence of making sure that you are hitting those marks, and if you're not, you really do the accountability work of understanding why and adjusting your trajectory, you're gonna survive any crisis, as opposed to a lot of people that won't. So, yeah, having that projection is key. As a CFO myself, um, I've seen the company I used to manage be saved, quote unquote, several times, just for the fact that we had those projections and we were updating them actually weekly because it was a fairly big going concern company. So we had to. And yeah, we not only survived, we emerged of COVID twice as big as we got in.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And before we wrap up, Rafael, I think it would be a crime to ignore this question. um, so, in the interest of time, I'll just quickly wrap it up with this. So, valuation, this valuation game, and as a person from a non-finance background, I got introduced to valuation, with Shark Tank. So, people believe valuation is mostly hype or it's kind of a market psychology anyway, and that founders shouldn't obsess over it. What would you say to someone who thinks that valuation is just a game, played by outsiders who don't understand the actual business?
Hmm, that's a great question. Yeah, people tend to see business valuators, if you will, like that. They don't understand what I'm doing. Well, they do, and I kind of distill it for you here. Here are basic things that they look at. They try to oversimplify things, and there's a reason for that because they are in a market where, if I'm an investor with resources, I can choose any option. And guess which option I'm going to choose? The one that is easy to understand and simple, or the complex, cumbersome, needs 20 hours of explanation why the business run. So the simplest business to understand are the most valuable. And I'm going beyond the numbers, right? If it's as simple as I'm selling water and the average human being needs 2 liters of water a day, well, guess what? It's easy to understand, right? So, as opposed to anything else that is far more complex out there. So Yeah, in a sense, I get the frustration with this outsiders telling me how much I'm worth. It has no idea of what I'm doing on the day to day. But
Yeah.
those guys have seen it time and again. They normally come from practice, not and tried and true and seeing it all. Um, and don't underestimate the value of having a guy like that in your corner in those high stakes moments.
Totally, totally. Brilliant. So, Rafael, if listeners, especially all the founders and entrepreneurs who are listening to this conversation, they would like to connect with you and they would also like to share their thoughts about this discussion, how they can do that.
I would love to engage in any conversations following this. They can find me at our website. It's tdpineadvisors.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn under Rafael Pinho. Pinho spells Pinho. And we're always there. We also share a lot on LinkedIn about practices and business and value building. So, yeah, reach out. I'll be glad to ask to answer to any questions.
Super, super. Listeners, I'll make sure to have all the details and links to reach out to Rafael Pinho on in the show notes. So just refer to them along with this episode on your favorite podcast platform. And I think I can 100% say that, listeners, in today's conversation, Rafael didn't just talk numbers. He talked about alignment, honesty, and what it really means to build a company worth something, not something that just looks good on paper. And it's easy to get caught up in growth culture and, kind of move away from the fact that revenue is only impressive when the foundation underneath it is stable. So if today's episode left you thinking differently about your business, that's the point. Clarity is uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's also liberating. So, thank you so much, Rafael. This was indeed a masterclass, and really, really loved the fact that you explain in the way that even I could also understand it crystal clear. So,
Mhm.
thank you.
Well, appreciate you and appreciate you having me. Thank you so much. And I want to give you an A plus in your Portuguese pronunciation of Pinho. You are the best.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Thank you, and to all the listeners, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of BizBlend. Until next time, keep building boldly, keep asking better questions, and keep blending business with the mindset needed to sustain it. I'll catch you in the next episode. Thank you.